Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. And in today's episode, I want to talk about how white mediocrity affects all of us, right? So I made a short and I was talking about the Atlantic article that spoke about how elite students can't read books. And this is very funny too, because you can very evidently see how there's privilege even in that, and how we look at this like a social phenomenon, and this is something that should be explored. Whereas if you are talking about public institutions where there's a lack of resources and it's very evident that the students are not going to be excelling, this is more so looked at like critique, and there's a little less digging or exploration around the topic and the subject. There's a little less advocacy to get these students the resources that they need. But I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how, because this morning I was thinking about mediocrity, and I was thinking about how we were living in an age where white people were finding privilege in identifying with mental health disabilities and illnesses and all these different things. Now, you can look at this from a lot of different angles. I like to talk about the real differences in the cultures, right? And how whites have always kind of gravitated towards pharmaceutical companies as a drug of choice. Whereas other, cultures may gravitate towards different things. Like Black people, it's more so like herbal things and things like that. Alcoholism is just like all over. So there's that. But we could take that into consideration as well. But I wanted to talk about the privilege in just being somebody who is mentally ill. And something that I'm kind of seeing is white people really run off with this whole thing of like, I'm autistic, and it's like you can't even have a conversation with people today. And you can also see this as well in integrated spaces where there are Black people who are also like in the same communities and same environments as white people. They will also kind of adopt this philosophy. And I'm starting to question whether or not this is a privilege, because what's very evident to me is that Black people on average don't have the privilege to be mentally ill, right? It is not something that you can select on an application and still seriously be considered for a position. It is not something to where you can just go to work, do a mediocre job, and we're going to talk about that in a second here. Or, you can decide not to meet your deadlines. You can, decide to, you need a little bit more assistance with your college courses or whatever the case may be. You don't get that privilege as a Black person, right? You don't get the privilege of, being slothful or walking around and people, empathizing with you for your lack of performance. Okay, you don't get that privilege. And that's why I'm posing the question in the community sector of whether or not being mentally ill is a privilege, right? And so I was thinking about the myriad of ways in which it's very evident to me that we are all impacted by white mediocrity, okay? And I was thinking about this in terms of like the educational system. So in most hierarchies, most businesses, most schools, there's white staff, a majority white staff, majority white faculty. Most of your supervisors are white, most of your managers are white. And because because of the white mediocrity, because of privilege in terms of like you just being selected based on the color of your race, and you are already deemed superior a lot of times. I think culture is progressing to where we're not necessarily in this space, but it's still very real. You don't really have to spend years in a position or spend years doing something to actually get good at it. So just like the short I made where I was talking about whether or not elite students are just privileged, and maybe there's really no such thing as elitism, it's just a matter of privilege, and white people are just, or not say white people, but people are just, well, yeah, on average white people, because we know affirmative action, that's got over, you know what I mean? Like Black people are not just passing through the bylines to get up in no elite institution. That's just not how it's going to go. So when you consider that, and you consider the fact that these students cannot read, right? You can very evidently see this. And honestly, everybody on this video, if you're watching this, you've had white supervisors who are very mediocre, and you've had Black people who are well-deserved of a raise, a promotion, or a supervisory role. But because that just goes against the social construct, that goes against the social hierarchy that always puts white supremacy as a priority, they will never get that opportunity, okay? And this is why it's important to have these conversations as well, because these are things that are going on in the real world, right? Online, everybody's an entrepreneur, everybody is successful, nobody's dealing with racism, it doesn't exist, it's a thing of the past. But I'm here to remind you that it will always exist, and it is very much alive and present in our modern day society, okay? So we talk about the myth of progression, so let's stay focused. I just realized that, back to what I was saying, and let me stay focused. Back to what I was saying about being in the educational system, right? Being a young, Black, gifted, and accelerated student is to your detriment a lot of times, right? There's a lack of resources in our community that support and aid in accelerated learning. There's not really a lot of opportunities or even programs for gifted students, gifted Black students specifically. And what's very evident to me, and what was very evident to me, is that when you are someone who, you're doing work, for example, you may have independent study outside of your school, outside of your, institution, and you come into the classroom, that is not embraced, right? That exceptionalism, that intellectualism, it's not embraced, right? And a lot of times your teachers and your professors are actually going to feel a little bit more threatened by you, and they're going to consider you to be problematic. And this is where we kind of have the prison to pipeline, right? This is where we have the Black girls in disciplinary action, right? Black students constantly being kicked out of classrooms and things like that, because the white teacher then feels threatened by the fact that you are smart and you are brighter. And I've had situations even in college where my professors weren't that knowledgeable, and they weren't willing to step down and realize, and let me not say step down, but they weren't willing to accept that and realize that, and they weren't even able to, and a lot of times these professors are not able to explain things to you in a different way, right? And it really goes to show their lack of flexibility and knowledge a lot of times. Because for those of you who don't know, on the back end, right, working as a substitute teacher for, in my own life, most of the times, these teachers, your teachers and professors, are just following a curriculum that has been given to them, right? There's no real life in-depth research or independent study or just any time taken outside of the course curriculum and the pamphlets that are given to them. And it's not to say that you can't stay on board. We know that there are a lot of faults within our educational system, to where a lot of times there's really not wiggle room outside of following everything that is within the course curriculum. But a lot of times it's a lack of I would just maybe say ambition or ingenuity, and I think that's where the white mediocrity comes in. And so, because you're gifted, and I've had this in my own life, but you understand things quickly, it doesn't take you long, you're then seen as problematic. And when you go to show that you're gifted, that you're bright, white people, and I've experienced this on both ends, white men and white women, mostly white women, but they're going to be quick to remind you that no, stay in your place, right? I'm intellectually superior, you're intellectually inferior, right? And because I can't rise to your level of thought and understanding regardless of the subject or whatever the case may be, now I have to come in and I have to employ, right, old slavery, old racist, old white supremacist, modern, current, present white supremacist tactics to remind you of your place, right? And this is why I always talk about the myth of progression. And so I guess I'm kind of just shining a light on some of the things that occur within academia, and I'm shining a light on the things that occur within the workplace as well, right? It can simply, I noticed that a lot of times you have people who are elders, like I said, they're in positions they don't really deserve to be in these positions, but because, just favorability, privilege, things like that, they find themselves in these managerial positions, and they're not really qualified, right? They don't really know how to explain it to a diverse group of people who have different learning skills, right, in a way that is advanced and simplistic. A lot of times it is they're lacking knowledge They're leaving things out. And when you make mistakes based on the lack of knowledge that you have for your job or your training or whatever the case may be, it then falls back on you instead of shining a light on the inadequacy of the training, right? Or the trainer and their lack of knowledge. And then, so you have that. And then you have these trainers who it's like, they'll take a very simple thing and they make it so complex. And you realize that they're not really making it complex. It's just the fact that they genuinely don't understand. And so it's like, if this person lacks understanding, why are they in a position of authority, right? And so this is go back to this. So do you see how that then affects everybody else, right? Do you see how that poor leadership affects everybody else, right? And just kind of tying this up, that's why I do believe that we struggle, to really have like true intellectualism in American society. I think that's why we really struggle to really progress, right? And to really understand. First of all, you have to understand a lot of white people in general are very narrow-minded. Just on average, like there's very seldom any historical knowledge about the present time, racism, social factors, sociology, societal pressures outside of white supremacy, right? So you already have this large group of people who are at the head and the forefront of society who have very little knowledge concerning any views outside of their own, right? So that's already a detriment in itself. And there's never any requirement to say, hey, let's look at this, right? And this is why white supremacy and white mediocrity persist, and we're all impacted by it, right? So to be excellent is to be taboo, and it's something that's no longer required of the vast majority of us, except for Black people, because, you have to be exceptional. You know what I mean? That's why, again, posing that question in the community sector, realizing that being mentally ill is a privilege, right? It's a privilege, right? It's a when you're white, you can come to work and say, I didn't get that deadline done. Yeah, I'm autistic. I'm this, I'm that. And this is a newfound thing. This isn't something that you've been born with. And this is not to minimize the real implications. But it is very evident to me that this has been a excuse. And I don't want to say excuse. Let's not say an excuse. This has been a justification at this point in time now, today. This is now a justification for white mediocrity. Right? Because now we've socially integrated so much so that white people for the first time are actually integrating and interacting with Black intellects. That's never been a thing, right? Most of them probably didn't even know that Black people could even form a sentence, right? And that's why when you come out and you're like, hi, how are you? You have manners, you're well educated, you're well rounded around a diverse group of subjects, you've got experience in different career fields, and so what if you were selected for DEI, right? Like now you're in position and they're like, who is this? Right? I have to put you in your place because in my mind, psychologically, this part of Blackness, I don't get to explore. Right? And that's why every time we talk about allyship and every time there's like Gen Zers on TikTok, it's always relating to the music. Oh, I like Chief Keef. So now you think you're an ally. Like it's always those things. Because this is the side of Blackness that you don't get to see. This is the side of Blackness that is still kept under the thumb of white supremacy, right? This is the side of Blackness that never gets the opportunity to rise and to actually show up in modern day society. This is the type of Blackness that for a lot of white people, they perceive this as very threatening because it is absolutely going to challenge white mediocrity.